My name is Rein Henrichs, and I'm going to be talking about security today, and specifically about why you, as an organization and as a developer, I think should make security your number 0 priority when writing software. So this is me. I'm on the internet in various places, and obligatory warning that I work at Living Social and we're hiring. And before I get started, I'd like to make a few qualifications that I think are necessary, and also a few thank yous that I think are in order. First, I'd like to thank the interpreters for being here. I think it's wonderful, and I hope to make their job very difficult by using a lot of large, jargony words that they'll have to spell out. And I also want to thank all of you for coming here. It proves that despite what the Python community says, Ruby developers do in fact care about security. So I do have the caveat that this talk will not make you good at security if you're not already good at security. There's just too much to cover, and I don't have enough time. But I hope that it will make you care more, and that you will use that resource of attention, and that you'll spend it on security. Because the most important thing is to find out what is the most important thing, and today I'm going to convince you that that's security. So before we talk about why security is priority 0, let's talk about what security is. And there's some misconceptions that I'd like to clear up. Is security a feature? Is security something that you can bolt on at the end of a development process to make what you've already done secure? No, it's not. And historically speaking, that style of doing security doesn't work very well. It doesn't lead to very secure products. And the reason for that is that security is actually a subset of reliability. It's really the core of reliability, because any security failure is also a reliability failure. If you lose data, if your data is compromised, that's a reliability failure. But not all reliability failures are also security failures. So Ryan Tomeko said in one of his talks that reliability is priority 0. And so I would say that that makes security priority 0. And there's another misconception that security is a static property of a system, that once a system becomes secure, it stays secure. And a software system is actually a very complex organization, and so security is actually an emergent property of systems, both how the system interacts with the environment around it, because a system can be secure in one environment, for instance, an intranet behind a firewall, and insecure when moved into a different environment. And two different systems or components can be secure in isolation, but can become insecure when combined together. So security is not a static property of systems, it's an emergent property. And the other misconception is that security is a product, that security is something that you can buy off the shelf, that security is something that someone can put into a box and sell to you. And Bruce Schneier, who's a very famous cryptographer and security person, has a quote that I love, which is that security is a process and not a product. And what that means is that security is a process of continuous improvement over time that has a cadence of discovery, assessment, mitigation, validation, more discovery, more assessment, and so on. It's a continuous struggle. So now that we've talked about what security is, let's talk about why we should make security a priority. For starters, security is your CEO's top priority, whether they know it or not. And they'll know it when they have a security breach. They'll be very well aware of how, for the past 2 years, it should have been a top priority when it's too late to make it one. So executive support is necessary to effect change in an organization, and having executive support for security is necessary because that trickles down and is what empowers developers to make their software secure, but that's not enough. Let's talk about you as developers and what your responsibilities are for making software more secure. First of all, you need to be aware that security is your responsibility, that it's a place where you need to devote some of that precious resource of attention. Because developers are the only ones that can make software secure. Your manager can't do it, your CEO can't do it, you can do it, and you're the only ones. Most software security problems are caused by bad software, go figure. And developers are the ones who are best suited to think about that software and change it. So let's also take a moment to understand what are our limitations as humans and why security is so hard. Bruce wrote a great book called Secrets and Lies. If you want an overall sort of 30,000-foot view of what security is, what security does, and why it matters, you should get this book. All of the books that I'm referencing here will be on my talk on speaker deck as hyperlinks, so you can click through. So one of the problems, one of our limitations is that humans are just very, very bad at assessing risk. We're very bad at correctly estimating things that don't happen very often. We're very bad at correctly estimating the downside potential of those things. Bruce has a quote that I love, which is that more people are killed every year by pigs than by sharks, which shows you how good we are at evaluating that kind of risk. And it also shows you that pigs are fucking scary. So I want to talk more about assessing risk in a moment, but I also want you to keep in mind that our brains are hardwired to get this wrong. So we have to think harder and overcome that liability and that limitation to get it right. So let's talk about why security may not already be a priority in your organization. Let's identify some of the blockers that are preventing executives and management from really placing the priority on security that they need to. One of those is insufficient funding and resources. Another is an absence of in-house expertise. Another is a lack of an effective security strategy. So I don't have time to tell you how to fix all those, but be aware that you might run into those obstacles when you're talking to your manager or when you're talking to executives about trying to convince them that you should spend more time on security. And one of the best ways that I've found to make security matter to the people who are, ultimately the executives that are ultimately responsible, is to make it meaningful to them, to talk about the repercussions and the consequences of security failures in using words that make sense in their language. Using technical words won't really get the problem across correctly to someone who speaks the language of business. So let's talk about a very short and very inexhaustive list of some of the consequences of security failure. The first is remediation costs, the amount of money you have to spend to make it right. And this includes liability for stolen assets or information, repairing damage to the system that may have been caused, incentives offered to customers or to partners to win back trust. Protection costs include things like making organizational changes, adding resources to address the security concern, like deploying additional personnel or technologies, training employees, bringing in third-party experts and consultants. Loss of revenue is an obvious one. People will stop buying a product that they don't trust in. But also, unauthorized use of proprietary information can also be a source of lost revenue. Compromise of brand and identity, loss of customer trust and goodwill. Goodwill is very easy to lose and very hard to build. So you can spend years as a company building the trust and goodwill of your customers and lose it in an instance if you don't allow security to be a priority. Finally, legal exposure, liability to litigation, fraud and extortion, and other illegal ways of damaging the company. And it's also important to remember that security is a part of a larger picture. Security actually trades off against other business needs. And so you have to decide, it's not just about making it as secure as possible, it's about making it secure enough for the business. So let's talk about some of the sort of the top level goals for security and some of the principles that we use to guide how we think about security. The first principle is that there is no such thing as a secure system. I said before that security is not a product, it's a process, and your goal is to make the system secure enough to meet your business needs now and to be continually improving your security over time. There are a couple great resources. OWASP is a ginormous wiki that will go into a lot of detail about many of the things that I'm only going to be able to skim over in this talk. John Viega has written a couple books on security. This is one of them. It's amazing. If you care about security, and I hope you all do, you should consider picking it up. So let's talk about 4 fundamental pillars of security. The first is confidentiality of your business information and your users' data. Things that are private need to stay private. Integrity means that things shouldn't change unless they're supposed to. Availability is, I think, a term you're more familiar with. It's the ability of the system to stay working over time. And accountability is the ability to trace an action in your system to a specific user and then hold them accountable for that action. So this includes monitoring, intrusion detection, auditing, tracing, and that kind of thing. So let's talk about some principles that we use at a higher level to guide our thought process around security. One of the most important is that your system is only secure as its weakest link, and that your potential attacker doesn't need to break encryption if one of the boxes on either end is vulnerable. Encryption is very hard. Whacking someone with a rubber hose is relatively easy. Defense in depth means that you need to have a layered security model, so a breach in an outer layer doesn't open up the entire world within. So you need a diverse set of defensive strategies that minimize the impact of that penetration. Failing securely means that if a part of the system fails, it should fail in a way that the system maintains its security, that the system stays secure. So for instance, a security related operation, if it fails, if there's an exception, it should cause the system to behave as if the operation had been denied. So for instance, login required in your Rails app shouldn't return true if it raises an exception. The next 3 are a positive security model, which means that we should prefer whitelists to blacklists. In Rails, for instance, we should prefer adder allowed to adder protected. And the reason for this is that defining what is allowed rather than what is disallowed limits our susceptibility to new attacks or unanticipated inputs, because there's an infinite variety of inputs that we can't protect against, and we can't protect against all of them. Secure by default means that your system should come with the most secure settings enabled by default. This means in a Rails app that CSRF protection is turned on, that cookies are encrypted. All of the default things should make your system more secure and not less secure. And principle of least privilege means that you should only grant the minimum level of access necessary to perform an action. And Unix's not fine-grained access controls make that difficult. But you should still try to separate users and groups and make sure that you give each operation as few privileges as are necessary to actually get it done. So detecting intrusions, obviously you need to monitor your system using things like checking for statistical anomalies and other ways to, if someone is attacking your system, you need to be aware of it. Compartmentalizing means to isolate a security failure so that a breach in one area doesn't allow the attacker to then move on to other parts of your system. And be reluctant to trust means that you should assume that the environment your system lives in is a hostile one and an insecure one, and you should minimize the amount of trust that your system gives, to other parts of the environment and to other components within that system. And finally, keep it simple. The fewer components a system has, the less opportunities there are for you to get something wrong. Now, some of you might be thinking back and saying, well, defense in depth and compartmentalization seem to imply increased complexity. And I would say 2 things. I would say, shut up, and you're right. Some of the principles in here are in tension with other principles. So making a system more compartmentalized is in tension with keeping that system simple. So be aware that you are trading off to follow these principles. So let's talk about the biggest issue in security and the hardest issue in security, which is managing risk. Managing risk is the way that we identify potential problems and decide on a rational strategy to address them. The goal of risk management is to accurately assess risk so that you can make well-informed business decisions about how to mitigate it. So risk, to define it, is an expected loss of one of the four pillars: confidentiality, integrity, availability, or accountability. And there's a book about this, so you know. It's good. Risk tolerance, first off, you need to identify your organizational level of risk tolerance. What is your appetite for risk? And more specifically, what is your CEO's tolerance for risk? Because that's where the buck stops. Once you determine what your baseline level of risk tolerance is, you need to start modeling potential threats in your system. You need to have an understanding of what are the vulnerabilities and threats in your system. A vulnerability is a flaw or weakness in the system's design, implementation, operation, or management, and a threat is a possible danger like an external attack that might exploit a vulnerability. So you have to have a threat and a vulnerability come together for there to be a problem. A threat in an area where there's no vulnerability, a dangling threat, is not a risk. And likewise, a vulnerability that no one can target, that's not threatened, is not a risk as well. So when doing this threat modeling, it's important to think like a hacker, to put yourself in the mindset of someone who's trying to break into your system. And one of the non-obvious parts about this is that hackers will spend a lot of time, are willing to spend a lot of time doing things that you think are stupid. So if you ask a lot of organizations like Microsoft, for instance, for a long time it was possible to exploit Word just by creating a file that looked like it was in the right format, but had some random bits at the end. And Word would try to process it and it would crash. And they asked the Microsoft engineers about this, and they said, why would anyone create a malformed Word doc? Why would anyone do that? That's stupid. No one would do that. So their failure to think the way a hacker would means that they weren't aware of that potential threat. And that vulnerability, which seemed like a dangling vulnerability to them that wasn't a real risk, turned out to be a real risk. So the actual process of modeling threats, one of the best processes for modeling threats is to use what's called an attack tree, which is to start at the high level, at the root, with what the attacker's goal is, and then to branch down into possible ways that they could implement their goal. So I'll give you a good example of how to intercept information over a secure SSH connection. This is the kind of thing, and it actually 3, 4, and 5 and whatnot are expanded as well into very large. So if you do threat modeling properly, there's a lot of work to it. I don't want to give you the impression that this stuff is easy, because it's not. So there are a lot of ways that you could do this. You could break the encryption, you could break the RSA key encryption, but that's hard. That's pretty hard. You could obtain a key. You could obtain the private key from the user by a number of methods. You could break into their machine. You could get physical access to the computer. You could compel the user to give it to you by blackmailing them or beating them with a wrench or tricking them into giving you the private key. And the same, you would also need their password. You could attempt to put yourself in between the client and the server in some way that you could perform a man-in-the-middle attack. You could attempt to subvert the server so that the client thought it was connecting to the real server, but in fact was connecting to your own server, because people generally don't pay attention to warnings, and then when they see that the host has changed, they'll go, yeah, whatever, I don't care, just let's keep going. So there are a lot of ways that if an attacker wanted to intercept this communication, that they could do it. So you have to make this tree, this list of all of those things. This is Bruce and I are talking about attack trees, if you want to research this more. And after you make this tree, and you find out all of these implementations of the attack, you have to start assessing each one in terms of the risk it poses to your system. So let's talk about risk assessment, because this is the part that this is of the two parts in security, I think this is the second hard part. The first hard part is figuring out what all the risks are in your system, and the second part is figuring out how risky they actually are. So the qualitative way to do this doesn't work. The quantitative way to assess risk is to create risk ratings, is to assign each threat a rating that talks about how impactful it is on your system. And there are a couple of ways to calculate this rating. And one of the simplest is to multiply the expected impact of this event in terms of lost revenue or legal liability by the probability of it occurring, which is a pretty simple metric. There are more in-depth metrics like dread. Damage is how bad would an attack be. Reproducibility is how easy is it to perform this attack. Or I'm sorry, to continue to reproduce this attack once they discover it, how easy it is to do it again. Exploitability is how hard is it to exploit this in the first place? Do you have to run a script, or do you have to spend hours doing it? Affected users is what is the breadth of impact of this threat? And discoverability is how hard would it be for an uninformed person to learn that this is a vulnerability and a threat. So you can assign numbers for each, add them all up, and you get a rating. Once you have rated all of these threats, you want to prioritize, sort by rating, and then you want to start addressing them. And there are essentially 4 ways to address risk. You can accept the risk. You can say, we're okay with this the way it is and we're not going to change it. For instance, credit card companies deal with fraud, but they do it in an interesting way. Credit card companies could make fraud happen a lot less if they wanted to, but they don't because the fraud costs them less than the operational cost of preventing that fraud. So they make a very calculated business decision to accept that risk. They mitigate it just enough that that risk becomes acceptable for them, and then they accept it. Avoiding a risk means don't do that thing that was putting you in the position in the first place. Transferring a risk means making it someone else's problem, my personal favorite. A good way to do this, and a good example of this, is PCI compliance. Don't let those credit card numbers into your system, then your system is not vulnerable. Use a service that allows you to do an encrypted sort of back channel direct from the browser via JavaScript, or posting a form and redirecting back. There are Braintree and some other people do this, so that the credit card data, that private data, never enters your system. Your system it never becomes vulnerable. PCI compliance then becomes, here's a self-assessment checklist, and you check off 4 boxes and you say, I'm compliant now. So transferring risk, if possible, can be a great solution. And finally, if you can't do any of the other 3, you have to mitigate it somehow. And we're going to spend most of the rest of this talk talking about how to limit your exposure to risk. The first and most important way to do that is to design your system for security from the very beginning. Design it from the ground up so that your system is secure. Make it a part of your everyday thought process. Make it a part of your code reviews. Consider things like inputs and data flows and how they can affect your system, users' roles and rights, and make sure you're doling out permissions correctly and as minimally as possible, having proper authentication and authorization for your users, validating the trust relationships in your system. What parts of your surrounding environment does your system trust either implicitly or explicitly, and what other components within your system do various components trust? And is that trust actually warranted? And is that trust creating a vulnerability for you? And the second step after making security a part of the way you design software is making sure that you implement that software responsibly. Try not to write your own cryptography algorithms. You're going to do it wrong, and then I'm going to laugh at you. Try to use systems that have been proven out there in the wild, like SSH, to be strong, hardened systems. If you're going to, for instance, write your own GitHub and you want to start managing SSH access to Git repositories, and you realize that an authorized key file with 10,000 keys in it is not very performant. What you don't want to do is replace SSHD. That would be the worst thing you could possibly do. What you want to do is replace what SSHD, which is an authentication protocol, SSH says, are you who you say you are? Replace the part of it that it uses for authorization, which is the configuration in authorized keys. But keep the actual hard part, which is SSH, the same, and don't try to do it yourself. Make sure that security is a part of your code reviews. The code review is the single most effective touch point you have for including security in the design and implementation of your software. It's the single best thing you can do, is to include security in your code reviews if you want your code to be more secure. So let's talk about, we've talked a lot about the importance of discovering vulnerabilities and assessing threats. Let's talk about different classes of vulnerabilities so we can see a little bit more about what I mean when I say vulnerabilities. There's a book about this also. There are lots of books. There are vulnerable designs. Vulnerable designs are vulnerable because the code can do exactly what it's supposed to, and the software will still be insecure. Vulnerable implementations is exactly the opposite. It means that the design is good and secure, but there's a problem with the implementation that creates a security risk. So for instance, buffer flows in a language that's not Ruby are a great example. Vulnerable operations mean that both the design and the implementation are fine, but you designed it and implemented it for a different environment, and when you put it into the one it's in, it becomes insecure. Also, don't forget that our users, the people using our software, are even worse at security than we are, because you've all self-selected to come to a talk about security, and they haven't. This is a Twitter account that retweets people who post their credit card pictures on Twitter. So people actually do this. There was a study reported by the BBC that shows that more than 70% of people would exchange their computer password for candy. I will give you chocolate if you give me your password, and 3 out of 4 people said yes. One of my favorite quotes about this, and pigs apparently come back into this again, I don't know what software people have with pigs, is that given a chance between a dancing pig and security, users will pick that dancing pig every time. And Mozilla says this a bit more verbosely. Essentially, what Mozilla is saying here is that users don't understand the risks involved in using the internet. And so we should, as much as possible, not rely on their judgment. Here's an example of how relying on a user's judgment doesn't work. No one clicks that no button. I want to go to that site. You're stopping me. Stop stopping me. They click yes. There's a view certificate button, but these users don't know what a certificate is. It's not providing them with useful information. So don't disregard that as good as your system may be designed and implemented, if its usability is a security risk, your users, some of them will be dumb enough to do something wrong. And in fact, it's not them being dumb, it's them having other priorities and not caring about security, which they shouldn't. You should care about security. They should care about getting their job done. So let's talk about some specific attacks or exploits based on these vulnerabilities, some specific potential threats. The most underestimated threat is social engineering. And I love this XKCD. And I'll give you a moment to read it if you can. Because the fact of the matter is, when people want to crack systems, when they see this really hard thing like RSA, they don't think, oh, what a challenge. I'm going to go break into that. They think, well, I could just beat the guy until he gives me his password. Kevin Mitnick, who you may know, who was at one point the most wanted computer criminal in the United States, said that companies can spend millions of dollars toward technological protections, but that's wasted if I can just call your tech support and get them to give me what I want. So the second large problem is malicious input, little Bobby tables here. This includes things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting. SQL injection is also an example of a cross-layer vulnerability. So when Bobby drop table's name came in as a parameter in the HTTP request, that was not a threat. It was a threat once it passed into the database. It's the interface layer with the database that turned that into a threat. So consider that some threats cross operational boundaries and are not threats in one place but become threats in other places. Hijacking and spoofing. Firesheep lets you use other people's Facebook if they don't connect via HTTPS. You know, just if you want to. This also includes CSRF, man-in-the-middle, phishing, a number of other attacks. So now that we've got an idea for what the problem space is and how difficult it is to plan for security, let's also talk about how difficult it is to respond to an actual security incident. And there's also a book about this. And the Wyconforno book is an excellent book that answers a lot of questions about incident response and also raises a few of its own, like, why does a scuba diver have a pickaxe? So one day, this will probably happen to you. Someone is going to break into a system that you own, and you're going to want to know what to do. And here's step one. Step one is fight your immediate fight or flight emotional response and take control of the situation. And stick to the script that you've spent months and months planning. Oh, you have that script, right? You guys have written that script, right? You have an incident response program, don't you? Yes, all of you, you do? Show of hands, who has an incident? I hear that hand raising is a good way to involve the audience. Okay, so no one does, that's good. 5 of you, I think. So it needs to handle resourcing and training, it needs to handle a plan for communicating, it needs to handle a standard operating procedure for responding to a wide variety of potential attacks. And it needs to be flexible enough to compensate for the fact that most attacks don't go by the book, are not done according to your script. The basic incident response workflow, flowchart, if you will, which is from that book and looks okay up there, that's not bad, is first identify that you are in fact being hacked. Difficult to do anything if you don't. And in fact, we don't have good statistics about this, but we're pretty sure that the vast majority of hacks go undetected. Because if a hacker does a really good job, you won't know that they were there. So spend a lot of time making sure your intrusion detection is as good as it can be. Once you've determined that there is an attack going on, you need to coordinate and start assessing the damage. Then you need to start mitigating that damage. Then you need to start investigating what went wrong and learning from, the experience. So accountability is the pillar that helps us detect, dissect, and demonstrate an attack. It's the thing that gives us intrusion detection. It's the thing that gives us audit logs. It's the thing that gives us tracers through the system. It's the thing that lets us know, who did what and what they did. That's critical. You have to make sure that as this process is going along, you document all the things you're learning about the attack as it's taking place. All of the symptoms you see in your system, things that don't make sense, things that are outside of operational boundaries, and any observations you have. Make sure that you write these down. They may come in very handy later, for instance, when you're filing this with the SEC or in front of a courtroom. Make sure that everyone who can do something about it is available and coordinated together. And then you need to start responding. You need to start doing things, taking steps to fix the problem. You need to isolate the systems that you believe are affected, and even the ones that you think maybe might kind of be affected. Any system that you think could potentially be a problem, shut it off, take it off the network, isolate it. Don't let who's ever in there do any more damage than they already have. And when in doubt, just nuke that system. Once you've come up with a fix, once you've figured out exactly what was wrong, you've come up with a way to fix your system, you've tested that fix against all of this data you have about the attack, because you collected all that data like I told you to. Once you've tested the fix and you believe it works, what you don't do is you don't patch the system that was running and then boot it up again. What you do is you rebuild or replace from scratch every system that was affected. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that's a lot of work, and I don't want to do it. Well, tough cookies. Because if you think that you know how to fix that system in place, that disqualifies you from having the necessary knowledge to fix it in place. So you need to, once you fix the system, once the attack is over, take all of that documentation that you were writing, all of that data that you gathered, turn it into a comprehensive incident report, file it away somewhere safe, and then don't just sit on it. Use it to learn, to educate yourselves, and to make your incident response practices better for the next time it happens. Let's also talk about after the incident happens, what do you do then? You have to disclose. You have to disclose to customers and partners who may be affected. You may eventually have to disclose to the SEC if you're a public company and it sufficiently impacts your financials. You can talk to your CFO about that and they can tell you how fun that's going to be for you. You may have to disclose in court. You need to make sure that that data is ready to do so. But you also have an obligation to disclose to your users and your other partners. You need to disclose as soon as possible. Don't wait a week or a month. Don't wait an hour if you don't have to. As soon as you know what's happening, and no sooner, you need to let users know that you have put them in danger and that they need to start taking steps to protect themselves because you've just lost your ability to protect them. So you have to make sure that they can now protect themselves. So you have a responsibility. You need to give them information that they need. You need to let them know that their password or their address or their credit card information may have been compromised. Whatever it is that you know, you have to tell them. And you have to do it in a way that both looks at the responsibility that you have to your users first, and then looks at the responsibility you have to your company and your organization second. So you have to do it in a way that starts to help you rebuild some lost trust as well. So here are some things you shouldn't do when you're disclosing an incident on your blog or your Twitters. You shouldn't minimize the impact of the incident to your users. A few of you might have been expected, but I wouldn't worry about it. It's probably fine. You may want to check your balance tomorrow morning, but it's probably fine. Don't pretend that you have suddenly become a security expert right after you got hacked. It's not going to fly. No one's going to believe you. And don't think that this is somehow an opportunity for you to get better PR. It's not an ad spot. That's not your job right now. So what should you say? It's very simple. What happened? To the best of your knowledge, exactly what happened. Why it happened. What in your system was vulnerable and allowed this attack to happen. And by the way, don't ever blame the hackers. You don't control them. They don't owe you anything. It puts you in a position of you're giving away all of your power and responsibility when you say, those terrible hackers did this terrible thing. The terrible thing that happened is that you left that hole in your system in the first place. After you fixed it, tell them what you did to fix it. That's the first step to rebuilding their confidence. And they're going to want to know. And then tell them what you're going to do in the future to make sure things like this aren't as likely to happen. What you're doing, how you're changing your security practices, how you're improving your security practices to make things better in the future. And tone here is also very important. So be humble in defeat. Be candid about what happened. Don't gloss over important details because they make you look bad or you're embarrassed. You're going to be embarrassed. You're going to be maybe the most embarrassed you've ever been in your life. We'll deal with it. But you still have to present some air that you kind of still know what you're doing, so try to be confident about the steps you're taking to fix this in the future. But don't use subjective wordings. Talk about facts. Talk about exactly what happened. Be objective. And here are some good examples of how not to do all the things I was just talking about. You guys remember when LinkedIn got hacked? Here's the first thing they said. On June 6th of this year, they said that our security team continues to investigate this morning's reports, which implies that they learned that they were getting hacked by reading blogs. And that's not good. And they also are unable to confirm that any security breach is occurring. And a lot of companies say this and then come back to you a day or a week or a month later and confirm that they were in fact hacked. No, very few companies say, hey, we might be getting hacked. Oh wait, just kidding. Just kidding, everyone. And while they were unable to confirm it, you know who was? The same day, CNET, a blog that knew a very accurate number of passwords that were available, hash passwords that were available. That's a very accurate, that's not like a few million. That's 6.46 million passwords. Why is that number so accurate? I'll tell you why. Because they were on the internet already, and they just did a word count, -L. That's it, that's easy. So the internet knows. The data is living right there on a public site for anyone to look at, but LinkedIn doesn't know. They're still investigating. They're still reading the blogs. They're going to wait for the blogs to come to a consensus about what happened to their system, and then they'll tell you about what that was. And there were security experts that had already found their hash passwords in LinkedIn's list, so they had confirmed that passwords that they only used on LinkedIn were in the list of passwords supposedly retrieved, hash passwords supposedly retrieved from LinkedIn. And if you're following that, that implies that it's impossible for that list to not be accurate. And then 3 days later, they say, yeah, there were some passwords on that list. Yeah, we're sorry about that, guys. That's bad. And they believe that they've fixed the problem, but if you remember, they never took any systems offline. They never had any loss of service. So I have doubts. They also said that, and I love this, all of the passwords on the published list have been disabled. I don't think it's a good idea to rely on information provided by the person that just hacked you to determine what the impact of their hack was. Do you think it's possible that they kept half of the list in reserve? Maybe. Seems like a thing they could do. And then they start falsely reassuring people based on this completely fallacious assumption. We don't think your account's at risk. You're probably fine. Don't worry. Which is exactly the opposite of what a proper incident response or disclosure would look like. And then they said that they've added an additional layer of technical protection known as this thing they should have been doing the whole time. That was it. That was the whole response. And then they had a blog post about how you can use your LinkedIn account to get a job. That was it. That was the whole response. eHarmony got hacked on the same day, June 6th. After investigating the reports, why are these people investigating reports? Where are these reports coming from? Why are they investigating their systems and their auditing and their incident detection tools and learning from those and making it clear that they actually were able to do so and not wait for blogs to tell them that they're being hacked? So they've found that a small fraction of their user base has been affected, which is once again a gross minimization of the risk, because it's very difficult if someone gets access to your passwords for them to stop. They're not going to say, well, we got like 1% of them. Are we good now? We're good, right? We can just not We can stop the download now, we're good. Okay, awesome, let's move on. And as a precaution, they have reset affected members. There's this idea that keeps cropping up that we know better than the hacker does who got screwed. And now we're going to let you know whether you got screwed or not. What's going to let them know whether they got screwed or not is whether that password they shared with their Gmail got them access to a password reset to their bank account, which depleted their savings account. That's how they know if they're affected, not because you tell them. So never make the mistake of telling users that you know which ones were affected. You can't possibly know. Oh, and by the way, the most popular LinkedIn passwords were things like God and work and 1234 and password. So let's talk about some good examples of what you should do. And one of my favorites in recent memory is the way that GitHub handled a recent private key vulnerability caused by Rails mass assignment vulnerabilities, which is, if you read the Rails security guide, which you guys all have, yeah, it's in there. I guess they didn't. But they did handle it very well after they were attacked. At around 9 a.m., they discovered, it's implied that they discovered that a GitHub user exploited a security vulnerability. Notice that what they don't say. What they don't say is, we've heard some reports that there may be a problem with our private keys. What they don't say is, we don't believe very many users have been affected by this vulnerability. What they say is, here is what happened. Here, and by the way, this was this thing that came out, this blog post, was within hours of the incident, not days. In the same blog post, they make it clear that about an hour later they fixed it and had already started an investigation into the root cause of the attack, which they then told us. The root cause of the vulnerability was a failure to properly check parameters, mass assignment, and then they talked about what will they do in the future to make it better. They're going to do a full audit of their code base. Seems like a good thing to do. I'm glad they're doing it. So that is the full story. What happened? Why did it happen? How did we fix it? What are we going to do in the future? And the thing that they don't mention here is who was affected. This is the only drawback that I have to GitHub's disclosure. They don't do a great job of mentioning who could possibly have been affected by this vulnerability. So that's a thing they could have done better. Last.fm recently got hacked as well. This has been a big year for people getting hacked. And their initial response was, we're investigating the leak, which not by reading blogs, but by investigating things like you're supposed to. And as a precautionary measure, and before they were even sure of the full extent of the damage, they asked all of their users to change their passwords. All of them. Not the few that they believed were affected, all of them. They found the file purporting to have hash passwords. They checked it against the database, and then while they're still in the process of getting all the information, they take action to help their users protect themselves. And to take action, they used as many communication channels as they could to reach as many people as possible. They didn't stick a post on a blog saying, hey, you might want to change your password, but no one should read this blog post. They used every communication means at their disposal to reach as many people as possible. So I'm running out of time. I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts. One of them is that I hope that I've convinced you that security is both important and very difficult, and that security will only happen for your organization. Your code will only get more secure if you guys all care about making it happen. So please do care about this. It's very important. And also, pigs are scary. If I have time for questions, I'm happy to accept them. This is right before the lightning talk, so you guys are free to bug out if you want to. Josh is going to heckle me.
What's the best way to protect yourself against being eaten by a pack of pigs?
Shark Tank. In the back. I can't quite, can you stand up and yell at me, please? Thank you. They're all terrible. They're all terrible. We just write a lot of stuff. It's again the problem. So the question is, do we use any risk management tools internally to help us do all that stuff that I said was really hard? And we actually don't. We do all the hard work ourselves. Yes?
Yeah, I was noticing the example, I guess, LinkedIn, their response to describe, and certainly, that's a bad example, but their response to describe how they're fixing it in the future. Mm-hmm. They said, we're solving.
Yes. But they sounded so proud. Which it wasn't, yeah.
But moreover, where do you draw the line between we're going to tell you our implementation and when that implementation, solving is the standard practice,
right?
But
right, it's a standard. So the question is, where do you draw the line between full and honest disclosure and not saying things that will make you look bad? Is that?
Well, no, how to say things that won't make you more vulnerable.
Right. How to not give the potential new attackers more information to make you more vulnerable. Yes? Yeah. Thank you. That is an awesome question, and the idea is that you should give users as much information as they need to know to make effective action. And if they don't need to know it to take effective action or to understand what's happening, then you shouldn't tell them, if that makes sense. Saying something like, we're salting our passwords now, doesn't really open you up to much risk. When you say it in this general tone of, look how secure we are, it just makes you kind of look bad. Any other questions? On the left here? So the question is, what do I think of Rails needing to get hacked in order for GitHub to take action about? I'm sorry?
In order for Rails to take action, Rails changed the default settings after their GitHub organization was hacked. Normally that.
Right. So after their organization was hacked, Rails changed some settings so that prevented that kind of thing from happening in the future. I would say two things. One is that that's a failure of secure by default. Two is that because we're really bad at predicting risk and assessing risk, they didn't realize that they were vulnerable, probably because they hadn't conducted a threat assessment there. In the front right.
For those of us who haven't been coding with risk in mind, what would you say are maybe like the top 3 things that you would focus on when you start a new app? Besides mass assignment.
So for people who are starting coding with risk in mind, who haven't done so before, what are some top things to think about? Specifically in a Rails app, I'm glad you asked. Let's talk about web security on Rails. Plant. So there's a guide that you've all read, right? You've all read this guide? Yeah. Show of hands, read the guide? Better than I expected. So this is a great place to start, but I'm still going to talk about all those things because repetition is important. So session hijacking, which can be prevented by using HTTPS. Mass assignment that can be protected by using adder accessible or new Rails 4 strong parameters, thank you. CSRF, which can be avoided by not using unsafe gets that cause change in your system, and by using a security token and things that aren't gets. So that means using protection from forgery, including the CSRF meta tag, so your AJAX calls have the header. You guys are probably all aware of these, but these are the things that you start thinking about. And then from here you progress on to trust relationships between different components in your system, especially many Rails apps are becoming more distributed over time and involving more components. So how secure is Redis, for instance? How much trust are you putting in Redis, things like that. Is that? Any others? We're running out of time, I assume. Front left?
So you talked about not having in-house expertise as a block to getting business management to want to
Yes.
make security a priority. How do you feel about bringing in outsourcing, bringing in hiring someone to come and be like a security guy?
So the question is, what do I feel about hiring a third party to come in and help you become more secure by doing a number of different things? I think that hiring a consultant is a terrible idea because one person won't have the breadth of skills necessary. Hiring a consultancy that can bring a number of people with different skill sets to bear on your problem is a much better way to go about it. I don't think that black box testing and pen testing are as effective as giving those people the keys to your castle and letting them see inside the box. Because the best that black box testing can do is say, either we didn't find some things so we think you're secure, or we found some things so go fix them and then you'll be secure. But it won't find everything. There's no real incentive for these consultants after they found the first 3 or 4 things to keep looking for more. So I think that without an actual understanding of how your system works, they just won't be as effective. So I would resist the urge to take the cheaper option, which is often pen testing and black box testing, and I would have a full code audit done, and I would have them use that as the basis of their probing of the system. So that's, I'm sure, all the time we have. Thank you all so much for being awesome, and please try to be awesome in a more secure way in the future.